I think there is so much momentum now. Like, we're not going back, right? We're headed towards a low carbon future. It's just how quickly we get there.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keefe, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. On December 8th, the three of us recorded a live webinar with special guest Robbie Orvis of the think tank Energy Innovation. We set the show up to do two things. First, to sort out what genuinely shifted in 2025 and what didn't. Second, to build a 2026 energy and climate watch list that helps separate real transition signals from the noise and the hype. It was a lively conversation with great audience questions, which is a good sign that people are trying to make sense of a confusing year. So without any further ado, here's the show. Welcome, Robbie.
Hey, Ed. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, it's our pleasure. So we're going to start with just a short scene setter with me and you. Then we're going to open up the conversation amongst the four of us, and then we'll finish up with audience questions. And please don't use the raise hand function. Send them in through the Q&A box. So Robbie, though, before we dive into substance, we had Hal Harvey, the founder of Energy Innovation, on EBC back like a few years ago now, August 2022. And he's talking about the book that he co-wrote called The Big Fix. And I'm pretty sure we only skimmed over Energy Innovation as a think tank at the time. Maybe you could give us the ABC 1, 2, 3 on energy innovation so people know where you're coming from.
Energy Innovation is a climate and energy policy think tank. So we work on helping policymakers understand and design the most effective policies for an equitable and affordable future. And so we do that primarily through research using tools like the Energy Policy Simulator and policy design advice based on our expertise. We do that all over the world, frequently working directly with policymakers and their staffs.
Great. Okay. That's useful context. Now let's dive into substance and a very sort of high level question. When you look back, you and your colleagues look back at 2025, I know we're not done. We still have 3 weeks to go. We're mostly done. What were the big climate and energy things that changed in this year?
I hope we're almost done. I'm looking forward to turning the page on this year. It's been a tough one for climate and energy, especially in the U.S. So obviously, in the U.S., the Trump administration took office, and the administration kind of quickly set to work undoing a lot of the progress that the prior administration had made. Whether that's changing the tax incentives to deploy and onshore manufacturing in the U.S., or the rules and standards that help ensure that significant levels of clean energy technologies are being deployed. Or, you look at the outcome of the latest COP and, the fact that we kind of failed to secure the next set of commitments that are in line with, global ambition on climate. So it's been a tough year policy-wise. I think the kind of interesting counterpoint to that is that in spite of all that technology, we still see investment and technology deployment, growing significantly. And that's happening all over the world. It's happening in the US, it's happening in China, it's happening in Europe. So it's been a tumultuous year for policy. And yet all that progress we've made on bringing down technology costs and scaling markets for new technologies is keeping a lot of the momentum that we had coming into this year.
Yeah, and so that's a great summary. I think we saw some pretty significant policy moves this year, and most of them, as you noted off the top, kind of signaling like a retreat on climate action in the U.S., but also here in Canada, which we'll get into. And in terms of COP and tumult, I was involved in some of the discussions leading up to the G7 Energy Environment Ministerial, and it was interesting to see the way that politics played out. The U.S. was not just MIA as it was with COP, it was outright obstructionist. It was like sand in the gears-like behavior. And without question, it limited the ambition coming out of the G7. But I want you to expand upon that. Do these shifts to like what's happened short term, expand upon your part around technology deployment. Do they really matter over the long term if the world is still spending like $2 trillion a year on the clean energy economy, close to 2% of global GDP? Or am I just seeing everything through rose-tinted glasses and it's worse than than that bottom line figure would suggest.
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, right. So every ton matters and every incremental ton is worse than the last. So in terms of losing momentum and progress, it matters. It makes it harder. One thing I like to talk about a lot is that you kind of have your power plants and your more supply side technologies and policies. But for a lot of things, we are limited by how quickly the stock turns over. So whether that's equipment in buildings or, equipment in industry, you're kind of relying on the natural rate at which equipment breaks down and needs to be replaced. And so every year that we fail to grow the amount of clean stuff that's being deployed and replacing fossil equipment, we're locking in more emissions, right? So, the loss of momentum is a little bit damaging for achieving, deep decarbonization in line with a safe climate future. That said, to your point, there's been so much progress made on bringing down the costs and making available all these clean energy technologies. I was looking at a graph from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, for example, and like 10 years ago, there were no EV sales at all, right? None. And now you look at, China is going to be more than half electric vehicles for new passenger cars. A lot of the rest of the world is on that trajectory. You just have that across the board. You have it for EVs, you have it for batteries, you have it for solar and wind, which are by far dominating new builds globally. And so I think there is so much momentum now. Like, we're not going back, right? We're headed toward a low carbon future. It's just how quickly we get there. And then because, climate change is a problem of the total carbon in the atmosphere, it does matter for, where we ultimately land in terms of how much warming we get. But these, I think in hindsight, will be looked at as more like blips on the road rather than, a fundamental shift. And that's largely due to just the economics of clean energy are spectacular now compared to where they were 5 or 10 years ago. And so increasingly you have just an economic argument for deploying these clean energy technologies, and policy helps. But at the end of the day, there's still a lot of countries and, private sector actors who are still going to choose what's cheapest. And that's been clean energy now for a few years, and it will continue to be that way.
Yeah. And I'll be curious to see when we get the data in if 2025 will set another new record for solar and wind installations. And the numbers on EV sales coming out of China are just absolutely staggering. You're in Arlington, Virginia. You're close to DC. So I'd love to talk just a little bit about U.S. affordability politics. Then we're going to pivot and talk about how they play out in Canada. So I recall in the New York gubernatorial race last month, the governor-elect, Mickey Sherrill, campaigned on like freezing utility rates and trying to lower electricity bills for many residents. And normally that doesn't pop up as a key election issue. It did. That framing actually helped her defeat her Republican opponent. So affordability is back in politics, and you have progressive politicians running on doing things to keep costs down. And that often means pivoting back to fossil generation, or at least they assume it means pivoting back to fossil generation. What knock-on effects do sort of things like that at the state level in New Jersey have on federal politics? And then David and Sarah, I'd love to chat about what knock-on effect that has in Canada.
Yeah, it is interesting to see energy prices and affordability being front and center. President Trump was on the air last week talking about how affordability is a Democratic hoax. But you look around at energy prices and the direction they're going and household energy costs, and it's clear that prices are going up, and that a lot of the increase in prices in the U.S. anyway is tied to growing natural gas prices. And so there is this interesting moment right now where I think traditionally there's been, to your point, there might have been a discussion around how, increased fossil fuel production and demand can mitigate some of that. But, building off of what we were just talking about with how far we've come down the cost curve for renewables, I think the narrative that's kind of taking hold and is, grounded in the empirical data is actually that our way out of this affordability crisis is through clean energy, right? We're not dependent on, the oscillation of fossil fuel prices in the US if we can deploy more clean. And, one of the biggest factors here, and be curious to hear how it's happening in Canada as well, is this data center boom that's happening in the US or underway here. There's so much demand for data center growth. And so you're seeing some of the forward markets where these price changes are being incorporated, reflecting the fact that the grid is expected to be highly constrained. And so those higher costs are being passed through already to ratepayers. And so in the US, given our permitting system and the challenge in building new stuff and how long it can take, when you couple that with the fact that there's this global shortage for new gas power equipment, it really means that the only thing that can be built to address this affordability crisis and this growing demand is things like solar, wind, and battery storage for the next, at least 5 years, maybe the next decade. And so, there's been just one study after another, a couple from us included, that are just highlighting the fact that there is no availability really to drastically grow the amount of gas turbines in the pipeline, but rather, deploying that clean energy that's already cost effective is the way out. And you have utility executives saying the same thing. Like the head of NextEra, John Ketchum, is on record talking about this repeatedly. That is at odds with what the administration is trying to do fundamentally and what they're talking about doing. But if you just look at the economics and the cost of stuff, right? Coal is so expensive to operate in the US. No one's building a new coal power plant. Gas, the prices right now, the futures prices for gas are the highest they've been in like 5 years. So gas is expensive in the US or getting more expensive in the US. And you just have this constraint on what can be built. And the cheap stuff, the solar and the wind and the storage is what can be built and will help bring down prices. So it's kind of amazing, actually, that we've gotten to the point where we can talk about clean energy as the solution to affordability instead of kind of the inverse of that. And that's due to all the policy and technology progress that's been made. But that is really kind of at the heart of the affordability crisis in the US right now. And at least to us, the kind of clear way out of it.
I can't help picking up on the loss of momentum question. I mean, it's clear there's a loss of momentum if you measure momentum by tweets or whatever you do on Blue Sky. But it's not so clear that there's a loss of momentum. I mean, obviously, the capital flow into the ground of clean energy is accelerating. I guess you could argue that the second derivative is slowing down, but I don't know if we know that. So I think it really is important to kind of distinguish this loss of momentum in the talk space than the real space. I mean, I got two questions. First, kind of specific one. What do you think about this kind of LNG glut that may come in the next couple of years in East Asia? I think there's a huge number of LNG plants coming. Of course, that may make prices in the U.S. higher because they've got export markets, but it will tend to, I think, really change maybe change the way Indonesia gets off coal, for example. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll note today, I just saw that one of the main coal plants that's supposed to be shut down early in Indonesia, they just announced they're not going to do that, which is kind of interesting just in the context of everything else. So it's hard to know exactly. If you look, for example, like in Korea, where they've been tethered to LNG imports, and they're some of the power plant operators have been running at enormous losses because they're basically running on fixed contracts for the power, and the LNG prices are exceeding what they're getting there. So you're seeing some of the early indications that, tethering, if you're, Indonesia or another Southeast Asian country and you want to tether your power grid to LNG, there are some serious risks to doing that. It is increasingly, as it becomes an internationally traded commodity, that's, you're just locking in, the price swings that opens up. I don't know what that means for Indonesia and other countries that are kind of figuring out all the different ways to try and to wean off coal. Obviously, Indonesia also has this target that's been announced by the president about, getting to 100% renewables. But, something's going to have to be there to balance it. And the question is, do you build out the whole infrastructure to support that? Or, what exactly does that look like?
And what is it? And how does it change if it's right that LNG prices are a lot lower there in the next few years? I want to just push you on one thing. You talked about like cutting emissions for a safe climate future. What does that mean to you? What's a safe climate future?
Well, I'm thinking of it in the framing of the UNFCCC. So 1.5 degrees is kind of what has collectively been targeted, right? But I guess the bigger picture is just like I said, every ton matters, and obviously we're all coming to grips with the fact of where we are and where we can get.
Just to say it, you know it, but I mean, there's no scientific rationale between 1.5. It was a political target, which I think was very effective in actually motivating action, but there's nothing that makes it particularly safe or unsafe. And it's every ton that makes it worse. And then, of course, it's not just about emissions cuts. It also is about removing carbon or reflecting sunlight, if that's what we end up doing.
That's right. Even in the 1.5 scenarios, especially this day and age, you have an enormous amount of overshoot and removal that you still need to do anyway.
Right.
So.
Which, just to be polite, is that's what it looks like in scenario land. In reality land, it means like pretending, like reality is you're not hitting 1.5 and then you're pretending you're going to do something in the future that you're not actually doing, and then not talking about the thing that would actually manage climate.
Wait, David, you're telling me that our modeled scenarios aren't exactly what's going to happen in the future?
I mean, obviously not that, but more than that, they've been sort of politically constructed in this weird role that's kind of disconnected. So you get these very strong statements that scientists say 10 gigatons of removal by 2050 or something, which I just think is laughable. And it is, I can't help poking you because you're sort of using that phrase, and yet we all know it doesn't really mean much. And I think part of our duty to the public in this time of change, a really exciting change, when we really are seeing this clean energy revolution, it is a time to start talking more directly about what the trade-offs are. And I think that's why I'm poking you. I know you know all the stuff underneath, but it's the stuff that hangs under those phrases. Anyway, over to Sarah.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on the rollback piece and maybe look at the Canadian story. You know, I don't think we need to rehash the whole hot take that we had. If you didn't hear it, go listen to some pretty sharp criticism, I think it's fair to say, of some of the policies that came out of the Canadian federal Alberta MOU. And actually, since we've recorded that, of course, the Alberta government has now put into regulation their change to the carbon pricing that in effect creates double counting credits that will flood the market and lock in the price at something like $20 or below. So I think, if there was any question about Alberta planning to negotiate towards a 130 effective price anytime soon, I think that sends a pretty strong signal. So I think it's pretty similar in some sense to actually, Robbie, as you were saying, the administration coming in and rolling back climate policies of the previous administration. That's a pretty good description, unfortunately, of what's going on here in Canada with the Carney government, despite the lack of change in party behind that. But I think, like you say, I think there's, and like David was saying on the momentum, there's some big steps backwards. And I think actually in the case of Canada and Alberta, we are going to see, unfortunately, slower progress on the industrial side than we wouldn't have otherwise. But at the same time, there is still, momentum moving forwards. And I think there's still this, you mentioned this idea of, certainly in Canada and the US, a lot of what has to get done is replace existing infrastructure with things that are clean. That's, of course, very different from what has to happen in a lot of other parts of the world. And so there's a little bit of a different story as well there, too, when you zoom out and say, well, okay, so there's, Canada and the US maybe not going as fast as they might have otherwise. But there's some bigger changes that are affected by the policies that I think are still going to continue on the global scale, right? And so in IEA's recent report, they talk about the fact that there's some of these underlying drivers, like previously population growth was a huge driver of demand increases when it comes to energy demand. And that's really, looking forward, kind of no longer the case anymore, right? There isn't really a significant growing population. Similarly, you have certain sectors, they flagged cement along with iron and steel as, previously making up about 20% of global energy demand in the early 2000s, kind of looking back. And they are now, below 10% and continuing to fall. And I think most interesting of all is that the growth growth, over the last, since the 2000s, say, was largely China. We've talked about where that's going forwards, but the new growth is really going to come from places where the sun is shining. And that new growth, it's not about replacing the existing high carbon infrastructure, but it's really about what you're building new. And there, I think those arguments around the costs, especially when you don't have to build out all this, say, underlying infrastructure for a fossil grid in the same way, I think the momentum there, I would argue, is not necessarily slowed down really by the US or China. I mean, certainly these are countries that are going to suffer more as a result of the failure of US and China to cut their emissions, as fast as they could be otherwise. And I mean, that is unconscionable, of course. But at the same time, from an emissions perspective in those places, perversely, some of these things we see popping up, accelerating growth, with the solar story, right? I think it was maybe a graph from Ember that was going around showing that once the U.S. kind of cut off Chinese imports of solar panels, you had quite a number of African countries. You could see that the installations of solar in those places were spiking, sort of as those panels were basically being diverted and finding a new market. So, I think it's definitely, if not a step backwards, I agree. I think it's a slowdown in Canada and the US, but that doesn't mean a similar slowdown elsewhere.
Pakistan is such an interesting story, to your point, where it's like nobody had thought that solar was going to boom in Pakistan. But to your point, that there's all this rooftop solar that's really helping to decarbonize the grid there. And that's largely this offloading of super cheap solar from China. And you've seen similarly in a lot of the countries and regions around China, you're seeing this surge in EV sales that was also totally unexpected. And that too is from this, supply of super cheap EVs. And it's not just there. I on another show, Ed Crooks was talking about his experience going to Jordan and seeing all the cab drivers there. They're all buying Chinese made EVs, right? Because they want cheap, reliable cars. They don't care where they're coming from. So we do get, like, I think US, Canada, Europe, we get a little bit of that kind of like Western blinders on sometimes. But it's totally, the growth in manufacturing of this stuff and where it's ending up is like a reason for optimism. I think probably have a whole show on the need to like diversify supply chains generally, but I think it's a good thing we have a growing manufacturing base for clean tech, and that it's going, if it's not going here, it's going somewhere else.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that those are some of those dynamics that are missing from energy system models, right? When we're looking at costs, and they really just don't capture those other pieces that, drives decisions.
Yeah. And just a comment, we have a growing manufacturing base, but it's still, by any measure, if you look at what's happening in China versus what used to be, the heartland of clean energy manufacturing in the world, the U.S. appears to have doubled down on fossil fuels and AI. And that's not a bad strategic decision, saying the latter, whereas China is really doubling down on clean energy and playing catch up on AI. But I do want to sort of pivot to a bit. We promised that we would look ahead. And, we've talked about sort of the good things that are happening. Sarah mentioned the IEA report. We had the IEA's energy economist, Tim Gould, on the show a couple years running when the IEA came out with its World Energy Outlook. And I know that the IEA itself has pivoted a bit and is starting to walk back a bit its prediction on emissions peak and, global peak of oil demand. And partly that's because they don't see the world moving forward with their stated policies the way that they did before. But I'd like to look just strictly at emissions. So what do the best now energy economic models, where do they converge on global emissions peaking? What range? Are we looking at the plateau starting this year? And moreover, based on where that peak and plateau starts to happen, what does the decline look like? Because my sense is, current policy suggests once we peak, we're going to decline sort of on a 1% to 2% annual basis. Whereas to your point, Robbie, and your description of avoiding dangerous climate change, you'd really need like a 6 to 7% annual decrease to stay within that threshold. And David, I know that you'll have some comments on this as well, but Robbie first.
That's a hard question to answer, in part because the models, you have similar models doing similar things, producing wildly different outcomes. And what you assume about the growth of the economy in different regions and population are also big drivers of that. I might tackle that by actually breaking it into some like constituent pieces. Well, let's start with the largest. In China, right, we expect emissions to level off this year or next year. And greenhouse gases generally within the next few years. And then they're not going to go down at 6 to 7% a year based on what's currently, in law. But even though, the government has the goal of doing that, but we do expect to see a leveling off and then a decrease going forward. And that's, as the power sector continues to decarbonize. I think the electrification of vehicles has moved much faster in China than anyone really expected. And increasingly, you're seeing some of heavy industry start to be targeted now by the government, moving off of, trying to move off of blast furnaces, for example, in the iron and steel sector. So, that's China. The U.S. also, even though we have this rollback of policy to the earlier points, we still expect to see U.S. emissions decrease going forward. And that, again, is from, there will be definitely a slowdown in uptake of EVs. Buildings and heat pumps are slowly being decarbonized in the U.S., and we still expect to see the power sector decarbonize as well. And a lot of the existing coal fleet be retired, regardless of what the current administration wants to do or tries to do. And then looking to a few others, obviously Europe, there's a lot going on in Europe right now, but on the brink of enshrining, arguably already have the 90 by 85 by 2040 reductions plus 5% offsets. So fully expect the EU, even if they retreat a little on that, we should expect a pretty rapid decline in emissions in the EU. And the last one, is India, right? And we do not expect to see Indian emissions decrease in the near term. But again, I think there's rapid growth in the EV market in India. And there's been really rapid growth in the deployment of solar and storage, especially the cheapest solar in the world, cheapest energy in the world is in India, Indian solar. You look at all those indicators, right? We haven't talked about, and to Sarah's point, like so much of the growth is expected in parts of Africa and in some Southeast Asian countries, right? And I think that's a little bit, to the earlier point about what happens with coal, what happens with LNG. That's a little bit more up in the air, but I think that generally, we're starting to expect to see a leveling off, and then depending on policies countries have put into place and whether or not they follow through on them, we could see, a steady decrease. But I think we have a little bit of a ways to go before we can kind of say that that's locked in. Some of the, momentum conversation notwithstanding.
Yeah, I'll just throw in one other data point on the kind of potential for a peak. So this also, I think, comes from Ember, looking at the first half of 2025, the growth in solar and wind generation was faster than the rise in electricity demand globally. So, that is, of course, that's just electricity. That's not the rest of the emissions. But given the increase in electrification as well alongside that means, a real decline in fossil fuels in the electricity sector globally and, potentially reaching then into other sectors that weren't previously electrified. So I think that is an interesting sort of, the challenge of like, when exactly is the peak coming? And do we keep saying feels a little like we keep saying it's just around the corner, but that's one more sort of concrete piece to throw in there. On the IEA, I do want to clarify one thing. So they didn't so much walk back the peak in oil. What they did was add back in sort of, I'll call it a frozen world scenario. There was a lot of Twitter and Blue Sky debate about that in previous years, where they took out this frozen world scenario, basically the one where you go forward with only the current policies. I think that there's good reasons to look at it from a modeling standpoint. On the flip side, I think it's the most often abused scenario because people point to it to claim that things aren't going to change. And of course, what's inherent in that scenario or what underlies that scenario in terms of a assumptions is the idea that there will be no new policies beyond what exist in the world. And of course, never in certainly the history that I know of climate policy, but probably I would dare to say in the history of government overall, have you ever had the case where you had no new policies from one year to the next? And so, yeah, indeed, if if we basically don't do anything more, we just throw up our hands and give up, we're not going to see oil peaking for a long time. But in that same steps scenario, that stated policies, you do still see that peak in oil.
At least this one didn't generate a sharp rebuke from the government of Alberta when it came out. So it must have been at least a bit more palatable.
I think the politics is a big part of it, right? Because I mean, the IEA, of course, is the political, it is subject to political winds, and it's funded by countries, including the U.S. and others. And so, it's a fine line they have to walk.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the other ones that aren't influenced in quite the same way, like the Wood-Mackenzie forecast has peaking in the next couple years. Obviously, Rystad has a peak basically this year, this coming year. I think the truth is we don't know very much. And in some ways, it doesn't matters rhetorically, but what's clear is it's going to plateau and bounce around a little bit. The big question, of course, is what happens afterwards. And, we've heard, I think, Ed say 2% a year versus 6 or 7. I think the answer is we really have no idea. I think that's the honest answer. I mean, we don't know how strong political efforts on climate will be 20 years from now. I'm actually kind of optimistic, but I think the truth is we don't know. And we really don't know how the technologies are going to change. I mean, I think certain emissions will go down, but how quickly they go down, there's just huge set of branching uncertainties. I guess I'd like to hear from Robbie kind of thoughts on the kind of leading indicators of stuff that might happen outside the stuff we've been talking about. So electricity system decarbonization with solar and wind and batteries are clear. EVs are clear. I mean, it's not clear how fast it will keep going, but it's clear that it's got this big momentum. I think what's less clear are questions like, for the first time, there actually has been more nuclear power generation. I wouldn't really call it a renaissance, but it's the first time it's turned around, and China really is building reactors for reasonable prices and reasonable times. Is that going to spread? And what do we think about, say, cement plants with CCS? Cements are still, whatever they are, 5% or so of global emissions is clearly a doable thing. What might happen? So I'd like to hear your thoughts about some of those things outside the stuff we talked about so far.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. One thing to add just before jumping in on that, to Sarah's point, and kind of like a note of optimism. For folks who are familiar with Climate Action Tracker, they put out this thermometer, the CAT thermometer, every year that is kind of a projection of where warming is headed with stated policies, frozen policies, pledges and commitments, and then we know the targets. But the main thing is I was just in Europe and met with some folks there and kind of was saying, it'd be really interesting to see what were you projecting a decade ago where we were headed with existing policy. And they're like, as it turns out, we just today put out a report, infographic showing that. And so the upshot is, to your point, Sarah, on like not knowing what policies will be in place, according to Climate Action Tracker, with existing policies, we've cut a degree of warming, right, over through 2100 relative to where they saw things with policies in place a decade ago. So that is a mix of, technology progress that's induced to some degree by policy. But point being that, and this, dovetails with what you said, David, like we don't really know. We don't know what the policies are going to look like. But it's great news that we've, according to, their projections, been able to cut a degree off warming in a decade or so.
To be clear, that's a degree off the expected median value. Don't forget, we don't have a link between emissions and warming. It's 1-to-1. There's an uncertainty factor of 2 or 3 there. It's so easy for policy people to keep not saying this thing. And yet, if you were a regular Joe or Sally six-pack and somebody was a bridge engineer and they said, oh, the bridge is definitely going to work for this truck, and then they later found out there was an uncertainty factor of 3, you'd feel like they didn't know what they were talking about.
Absolutely. Yes. Central cases, of course. On the other tack, I think, and again, this kind of dovetails with what you said, David, like there's been a lot of progress made. So if we think about, a lot of people will still call the industrial sector hard to abate. Well, some of the stuff is hard to abate. But as it turns out, we use a ton of low temperature and medium temperature heat for industrial processes. A lot of that can be decarbonized with existing industrial heat pumps today, right? We don't need a technology breakthrough. We've got it for a lot of the low temperature stuff. The harder ones, we're thinking about cement, and you mentioned CCS or iron and steel. I think the jury's still out. I just heard about a company that has a novel process for separating iron from iron ore with very little energy input and below today's costs, right? No model is capturing that. I can guarantee you that. That's projecting into the future. So I think the one constant is generally that like technology innovation has outpassed anything that our integrated assessment models or our climate models are able to include. And so that provides some reasons for optimism. I think relatedly, like there are some of these sectors where the technology is actually there. It just hasn't been like the focus. All that said, a lot of it comes down to cost, right? And so if you're trying to decarbonize your iron and steel sector and you're looking at, should I do a blast furnace using really cheap coal, or do I want to do a direct reduce iron with natural gas and electricity? At the end of the day, it's going to be the cost that matters and the fuel cost, right? And so that is going to be highly geographically differentiated. In the U.S., for example, where we've had pretty cheap gas and pretty cheap electricity, we have heavily decarbonized our iron and steel. But if you look at other countries that have really cheap coal and don't have much access to gas, that's where you see a lot of these blast furnaces that are still producing some of the highest emission steel in the world. A lot of these industries, the technologies exist. Obviously, if we want to get like fully decarbonized steel, then we need to find another feedstock that's not coal or gas. A lot of people talk about hydrogen or biomass-based feedstocks, which we kind of know how to do. It just comes down to cost. And so the question is, how quickly can we scale the technologies to bring down the costs? Can we pivot them to being produced electrolytically using clean energy? And what's the willingness to pay or willingness to accept for that stuff? The Bill Gates likes to talk about the green premium and getting the green premium down to zero. Certainly there's a big kernel of truth in that. And also that a lot of the technologies are being developed or have been developed. Last point is just on nuclear. I always say, like, I would love for there to be a nuclear renaissance. I would love to see small modular reactors, be something that we can deploy and address those. I just always hear it's 5 or 10 years away, and it's been that way for 25 years. So,
but no, but something actually changed. So first of all, small modular reactors may or may not be relevant at all, but I think it is important to say that it actually difference on the ground now. I'm not a giant nuclear advocate, but it does feel different. Objectively, we have seen the bottom turn around.
I think so. And I mean, China, South Korea is really interesting.
The data, or?
Well, I don't know. I think that there's a question around safety, I think, and what safety measures are being put into place and what the costs are. I think the U.S. might be on the one end of the spectrum of that, where there's typically been very high and expensive safety measures. I don't, from what I've seen, I don't know that China's building to the same specs. And so maybe there's something in between. I think it depends on countries and costs and willingness to tolerate risk. And I'm not someone, I think there is a public perception issue with the risk of nuclear that is maybe a little bit independent from the actual risk. So I'm not saying that there's necessarily strong logic to that. But I would like to see more data on the safety measures comparatively around the world. I will say that we're working on some data and modeling for South Korea, and I did triple check the costs that our partners were putting in there because they were much lower than I expected, and it's based on real world achieved costs. So I think there are, to your point, some real cost breakthroughs that are starting to be achieved in kind of the more traditional nuclear plants that it was surprising to me to see it. China, I kind of have an asterisk on, but South Korea, I was quite surprised to see the costs that are coming in for those new reactors.
Yeah, I mean, China is mostly building basically now Westinghouse AP 1000 variants. So I think those I think are safer than the median US fleet. I'd be happy to live by one. But anyway, enough for now.
So before we move on to the future, I just wanted to throw one point in there, sort of philosophical in a way, on the peak, because, the analytical part of me says, well, the peak is sort of nice to talk about, but when it comes to actually climate impacts, it's only half the story. And therefore, it doesn't really matter in that, if we reach a peak somewhat further out, but we're getting a faster decline versus peaking sooner, but we have this long tail, of course, that might be worse, that the sum of the emissions is what matters. But then there's part of me that, reflects on things like the Paris Agreement and the way that I think having these targets does motivate action. And so I do kind of, I guess, and then on the side of really being able to demonstrate a peak in the decline, even if it's small, I think could actually sort of provide a bit of a momentum in and of itself, right? Like a proof of concept that we can actually do this, a real departure from the way that, things have worked historically globally in terms of emissions increases. I'm curious, Robbie, or anyone else about where, which side of that debate do you fall on?
I think having, to the earlier discussion on 1.5 too, having something to aim for like that is a helpful motivator in what we've seen with solar and wind to some degree and storage and EVs is like, once you have that point to aim for and you get the policies in place to scale the industry, some of the industries to meet that point, like that creates this somewhat like inexorable march towards those technologies becoming available, right? Like, they're not going to shut down EV plants en masse now because the target shifted, right? They're going to continue to innovate. They're going to continue to drive down costs. So having those things to aim for can help put the steel in the ground to get the, hopefully it's low carbon steel, put the low carbon steel on the ground to get those techs, invested in and deployed.
I've got actually one question. What is the single biggest metric that matters to you, Robbie, that tells us it's going to tell us fast whether 2026 is a turning point or not? It's not, let's say it's not aggregate emission statistics. It's not policy declarations. It could be David's Westinghouse AP 1000 installations. It could be global year-over-year change in fossil fuel consumption that's measured in exajoules. It could be grid investments, EV market share trajectory, global battery storage installations. It could be all of the above. I'm just throwing them out, but I'm curious what one or 2 to 3 indicators are you going to be most paying attention to?
I do look and follow like coal consumption in China. That can vary quarterly, monthly, and annually, but it is a good indicator since China is the largest emitter in the world of where things are headed. Can be hard to separate the signal from the noise. One down year for hydro, for example, can cause an increase in coal, but that's a little bit more noise than signal if you're looking at long-term trends. So for near term, right, we always have all the emissions data is on usually on a multi-year delay. There's some groups, Rhodium puts out their latest. But I do look at kind of a lot of sales. So you have kind of energy consumption, whether that's coal, primarily coal, but then also looking at sales figures for EVs, sales figures for heat pumps. If you can find it, it's pretty hard to find that stuff. But those are the best kind of near term indicators, right? Knowing too that they vary seasonally. In the US, for example, as the EV tax credit was expiring this year, you had this enormous surge in EVs, and unsurprisingly, all of the media was like, oh my God, we have this huge surge in EVs. Well, what do you think happened the month after that, right? Sales dropped off because the tax incentive went away. And the next media cycle was, oh, EVs hit, multi-year low. Well, it's because you're looking month to month and there's noise in there, right? So it's a little hard to do that. And you have to be careful not to try and draw conclusions from that noise and look for the signal. So I think that, annual fuel demand, accounting for changes to the system, but really annual deployments. And to Sarah's point, seeing that the deployment of renewables outpace the growth in electricity demand. That tells us that, we're on a path towards decarbonizing power if that holds, right? And we know there's going to be growth in power there. But, long answer to your question, if I had to point to a few, it would probably be coal consumption in China, EV production and exports from China, and sales of EVs in some of the leading markets, India, US, EU, and China are some of the big ones, looking at sectors that are going to be able to move enough to flatten or drive down in the near term.
Got you into your question about, or to your point about EV drivers. And which country was it, Robbie? Was it Indonesia?
Jordan.
You mentioned? Oh, Jordan. Yeah, sorry. If only here in North America we opened up our market to BYD sales, imagine what EV sales would be at a significantly reduced price point. But in the infinite wisdom of our governments, they see fit to keep it closed to prop up the incumbents and the incumbent EV producers. Wouldn't that be wonderful to change? Listen, I'm going to take us... Okay. Okay, David, counterpoint.
Who knows? I don't. I mean, this is on the day where China just passed $1 trillion net import surplus or export surplus. I want things to decarbonize faster, but I think there are true political problems with all manufacturing going to China, and I wouldn't sweep them under the rug.
I agree with that.
We have friends in our extended family who work in those auto plants. I don't want them all to be wiped out right away. I want change. But
I don't know if it's just a matter of time. Like, how much do you prop up a market to make the change more gradual? Because it's just a matter of time before Chinese EVs are dominating. Maybe you need to rip off that Band-Aid.
100% agreement that if we're just propping it up to make it die more slowly, that's bad public policy. But we need to do something. We can't just have all manufacturing go to China.
This is the problem, right? We've insulated the markets, and we're not seeing the change from the big automakers. It's like kind of the worst of both worlds at the moment.
Here.
Okay. I'm going to move us to questions. Liz Addison asks, Venezuela claims to have the world's largest reserve of oil and gas. If their political situation stabilizes and their fossil industry comes back, will there be a reduction in price with an attendant increase in demand? I'm opening the floor to whoever wants to weigh in on Venezuela.
I'll jump in and say, I think this is actually another example of the sort of up and down that Robbie was saying, that, you can't look at one data point and sort of make a conclusion, and probably not even two. So I think there is going to be this bumpy transition as we hopefully, are scaling down our use of fossil fuels, where you sometimes have supply outpacing demand and prices falling. And, maybe then you do get some feedback on adoption. But I think that we're out of the woods in terms of really cheap oil just completely flooding the market and stopping the transition, because all of a sudden people decide, wait, like, I'd rather have that. I think that kind of risk is more meaningful towards the very beginning of a transition of trying to get a totally new technology off the ground, where if you can just crush it on a price basis, you might be okay.
Okay. I'm going to keep us going on to the next question. Friend of EVC that you've heard many, many times before, Rob Tremblay.
Okay. As long as I've been thinking about climate policy, which to be fair is not that long, all things considered, I thought there would be a virtuous cycle between kind of cost of clean tech and implementing policies that accelerate their adoption. And I think that's kind of informed an idea that the most important policies right now are the ones that are likeliest to reduce the cost of clean technology. Does the moment we're in right now, where it does seem we've achieved a lot of the cost declines that we've needed for kind of economic deployment of clean technology, kind of show that theory is wrong? Or are we just in sort of a bit of a blip right now, and we might kind of get closer back to that world in the future?
I'll take a first crack at that. I think it's more of a blip. I think and I think there's a lot of substance to that theory. If you look, you can look around the world. I mean, EU is another example, right? Just mentioned they're just put in place a 90 by 2040, 5% of that's offsets, but that's evidence of that. You have what's happening in China with the growth of EVs also being part of that. If you look at the subnational level in the US, you have a bunch of states in the past few years that have put into place clean electricity standards. You have, California had in place a standard to basically get close to 100% electric vehicles by 2035 that a handful of other states adopted. It's about 40% of the market. The current administration basically blocked them from doing that. But I think it actually kind of ties into what we're just talking about, right? The road to decarbonization is not straight. It's not linear. It's bumpy. But if you have technology kind of marching along, you're gonna trend towards that, that long-term deployment of clean electricity, clean technologies that drive down emissions, and policy that kind of underlies and supports that, even if you have periods where you're kind of going back on it. So I think the long-term trend is, aligned with your thinking on it, even though administrations change and priorities change. But I do think you'll continue to see policy that is aimed towards growing the share of clean technology for no other reason than it's increasingly the cheapest thing you can do.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. I totally agree that I think it's sort of a pushback and a bit of a dynamic that goes in both ways. I think certainly the lower costs, as we talked about, without the policies makes it easier for these things to be adopted. And then I agree, Robbie, that I think we see those policies come back. I would characterize this pushback both on the policies and also, if you look at sort of COP over the last few years, in something that I've learned from Leah Stokes, Professor Stokes, who I think we had on the podcast a while back now. She's a political scientist at UC Santa Barbara. And she and others have written about this idea that incumbents, they don't have the bandwidth and it doesn't make sense for them to go around fighting, every single possible new technology. It's only when these technologies become sufficiently large and sufficiently threatening to their incumbent position that they actually start pushing back. And so, there's sort of like a perverse good news way, in a sense, to read this like fossil industry pushback, whether it's, showing up in huge numbers, unlike they used to do at COP, or this like pushback on climate policies as a sign that we're actually moving the needle when it comes to, the ultimate goal of reducing emissions, which means reducing fossil fuel use. And so I think that sort of both are true. There is a virtuous cycle, and certainly also you start to have more of a clean tech incumbency that can also exert political power. But there is also, I think, very normal that you start to get this pushback from the fossil fuel incumbents and policy rollbacks because it becomes a real threat. And in a sense, it becomes worth paying attention to and worth devoting, more time, effort, and money to. So I think that's another read, or maybe not another, but an additional read to what's going on in this situation.
I feel like we can't have a genuine podcast unless we build in some question about AI, and we really have only skimmed over it so far. So, Robbie, up here, we're getting so much media on the increase in demand of electricity coming from data centers, including in the area where you live, which is a real hub, in the area where we live in Alberta. Now, these are, I would say, overinflated estimates, just projects that have been announced. But our electricity system operator here suggests that if all these centers were to go ahead, you're actually going to need to double generation of electricity on top of what we currently have, which is pretty astounding. What do you think in 2026? What do you think in terms of AI reshaping the electricity value proposition? Is it going to be very consequential? And, some of the buzz, and we had this with Bitcoin as well, and that, well, the tech companies, in this case, if they follow through on their commitments to power data centers to a 24/7 clean energy, it's going to be this great driver of new and clean electricity demand. And it's actually going to even more. It's going to deliver everything. It's going to deliver permitting reform because they need that electricity now. What are your thoughts?
A nice small question at the end of the show here. It's very interesting, looking ahead. In the US, we have midterms this year. And you're already seeing fissures in the base that supports AI because of the anticipated impact that it is going to have on affordability. Governor DeSantis in Florida today, right, who's almost as conservative as they get, he came out and said he thinks AI data centers should be restricted in Florida. And so there is a lot of uncertainty right now about how different state policymakers, federal policymakers are or aren't going to intervene. I think we're, to your point, we're seeing exactly the same thing. I think we have 100 gigawatts expected of data center peak power load that's expected to come on in the next 5 to 10 years. which is enormous, and it's heavily concentrated in a few areas, Virginia being one of them, Ohio's another. And so, I mean, that is untenable with the ability or inability, I should say, to build here. So if I had to look for it, I think there's a few things. I do think some states and utility commissions will probably start putting into place restrictions. Those could be either flat out bans, or they could be requirements, which is probably more likely, that data centers have to bring their own supply. And, you know, data centers, the energy portion of their costs relative to their fixed costs from all the equipment are pretty small. So they're basically willing to pay anything for power. And so I think that is a likely path. The other thing is, a lot of the data centers have said, well, we're not going to be inflexible. We're not going to be flexible. We can't be flexible. We have to pay off all of our investment. Now the utilities and the grid operators are saying, well, then you can get in line with everyone else and you can wait 7 to 10 years to connect. And so all of a sudden you're starting to see some data centers, you know, Google leading the way, saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we can be flexible. You know, if it's the difference between being built or not being built. So I think we're going to see a handful of rules. And here in the States, FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is looking into this right now. We're going to see a handful of rules about interconnecting data centers. And we're going to see, I think, a lot of the midterm run up is going to be focused on affordability, and data centers could be a pretty central part of that. So I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's going to be a topic of conversation. And I think the question is ultimately, like, to your point, how much of what's been announced actually gets built, and how much of that comes with its own supply. If it's coming with its own supply, is it going to be clean? Are they going to do a bunch of on-site diesel generators, which is what the Secretary of Energy in the U.S. is now saying, since we can't really build anything else? And if that happens, it's an environmental nightmare, not to mention horribly inefficient and expensive. So I think the jury's out, but it's not. The topic isn't going anywhere anytime soon in the U.S.
It certainly isn't. But I just, newsflash that we all know, but answering Ed, there's no chance all the things that are proposed will be built. In the last 6 months, the increase of electricity demand in the U.S. has actually slowed a bunch from this earlier kind of 4.8% to a 2.3% on an annual basis. And about 80% of that was in fact made up by the growth of renewables. So I think we don't know what's going to happen, but I think that I predict that there's going to be a bit of a bubble here. Not that AI won't transform things a long way, but I would guess that the data center thing will turn out to be less important electricity demand than we thought. But who knows? We might be wrong. That's what next year will bring.
I think, yeah, to your point, the current projections are not what's going to be built right there. There's definitely a bubble. And then, where does it land?
All right. Listen, I think I'm going to wrap us up. We're at time. Robbie, you've been a wonderful guest. This has been very insightful. And now I think we're all waiting even more with what 2026 is to bring with bated breath. So thanks so much. And we're really grateful to have had you on.
Thanks. Great being here to talk with you all.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Amit Tandon. Our show and title music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the North Family Foundation, the Conscon Foundation, the Trache Family Foundation, and you, our generous listeners. Special thanks to all monthly donors and all those who generously gave during our annual listener appeal. We reached our 5K target, and for that, we're all grateful. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our 2 shows with International Energy Agency Chief Economist Tim Gould on the IEA's annual World Energy Outlook. One is from Season 4, Episode 4, and the other Season 5, Episode 6. We'll be back with an Ask Us Anything show in time for holiday listening, followed by shows on China and aviation in January. In the meantime, send in your questions for the Ask Us Anything show to info@energyversusclimate.com. See you later this month.